Let's consider a very important question. Who is the real audience for your source code? Is it the machine or is it another human being? Well, to the extent that the code has to be syntactically correct, it is the compiler or the interpreter that you're writing the source code for. But in the bigger scheme of things, that's really not the case. You see, software is not a one-time deal that you can fire and forget. It evolves with versions and patches. It needs to be maintained long after it's released in the wild, often by folks who didn't write it. Let's take an example. You have a function named factorial that takes an integer as input, calculates the factorial, and returns the result. As long as it is syntactically correct, the machine is happy. But what if the programmer chooses to do something different in the method body? I can compute the next nearest prime number instead of a factorial and return that as the result. Heck, I can even write a unit test which asserts on the value that I think is right. As long as the syntax is not broken, the compiler doesn't complain. The unit test is happy, everything's good. But is it? What's wrong with this picture? Well, this piece of code is that proverbial poop that's waiting to hit the fan. And when it does, not if it does, when it does, you've got an unhappy customer. You spent a lot of hours looking at stack traces, dumps, and yes, the source code. So the picture really tells us that when it comes to source code, readability and comprehension are king. A few years ago, I came up with this idea of source code is for humans. And this is really about the perspective with which we approach coding. Everything that we associate with good programming or software engineering practices, design patterns, clean code, indentation, conventions, etc., follow from that perspective. So I propose a change in perspective. When you write the code, you're writing it for another person, for your own future self. And that changes everything. Let's explore a little bit to understand some of the nuances. Today, in today's world, we're living in relative prosperity when it comes to resources at our disposal. Folks often compare the Apollo 11 computer with modern day smartphones to underscore the point. But even without being so dramatic, it's easy to appreciate that machines have become faster. There's a lot of storage. Memory is no longer a constraint for the most part. And yet, a lot of programmers continue to code as if trying to squeeze bits out of every byte. Remember unions in C? While I have personally nothing against unions or bitwise operators, my point is overeager optimization, focusing on the trivial, really is not the best use of the programmer's time. The reality is, in today's world, there's no real need to worry about the source code being 10% larger due to longer symbol names, having multiple files, loosely coupled objects, and so on. Premature optimization generally does more harm than good. Compilers are pretty smart these days. You can let them optimize it for you. Now, this is not to say that you don't have to worry about the time complexity of your code. Certainly don't use a polynomial time algorithm when a logarithmic time would suffice. The point is not to worry too much about things like temporary variables, initialization, and assignment. Don't take shortcuts on class hierarchies, interfaces, and such, because the source code looks bloated. Readable code goes hand in hand with good design. A well-organized project structure makes it trivial to find a certain file. I shouldn't have to guess where your logs, your configuration files, your header files, shared objects, third-party dependencies, readmes, build artifacts live. It should be obvious based on whatever framework you're using. It should follow certain conventions. Intention-revealing classes, methods, variable names go a long way in self-documenting the code and helping with debugging. Using natural language phrases rather than cryptic abbreviations make reading the code a lot easier. The question to ask would be, how can we reduce the cognitive load on the programmer who's trying to make sense of what you wrote? often with limited context. Software engineering as an industry is relatively young, so we don't see this happening. We don't see this in front of our eyes, but it is true. The lifespan of the code actually is much longer. It's actually even longer than the programmer who wrote it. Software escrows are really happening. They're real. So it's important to establish conventions and then stick to them. Indentations, spacing, braces, naming, they're all important. Yes, conventions and processes can be annoying when overdone, but chaos ensues when there are none. One needs to find a balance. Also, every language and framework is different. It's generally the best to follow conventions that are language specific. Furthermore, forcing yourself to think about an appropriate class name can reveal design flaws. It's for a reason that it is said that one of the toughest problems in computer science is naming. Maybe your class is doing too many things, and that's why you're not able to come up with the right name for it. That anti-pattern is called the God object. Maybe it's not doing enough, or is simply piggybacking on other classes. These two anti-patterns are called feature envy and freeloader, respectively. Same goes for project names, package, library, files, method, and function names. If you have a get dimensions method, it should get you the dimensions and not mutate dimensions. So the overall ideas are really simple, and most developers get it. It's either the lack of discipline or the temptation to give in to an arbitrary deadline that often gets us. So my basic point is changing that perspective and thinking that you're actually writing the code for yourself, your future self, and for other human beings, and not for a machine. Yes, you have to get it to be syntactically correct. It has to follow certain conventions, but that's just the very basic. The final point I want to make is about comments. Comments have their place and are important, but wouldn't it be nice if the code was self-documenting? There's a school of thought that believes that comments should not try to describe the internal logic of a function or a class, because as the code undergoes revisions, the accompanying comments are seldom updated. This divergence of documentation and implementation can lead to confusion and heartache. At a minimum, treat comments and documentation as first-class citizens. Well, happy coding. And again, remember, software, the real audience for your source code is humans. Thank you.